This is a tiny but powerful camera that you can pick up super cheap, and it is almost the perfect camera for getting some cool, unique shots on a budget, except it's not perfect. But wait till you see what it can do. This is the Sony DSC-V1. It's a truly compact camera from 2003, but don't write it off just because it's over 20 years old. It still packs a punch. I grabbed it because I thought it ticked all my boxes for this project I'm working on, which is to take unique color infrared landscape photographs of my local southern Iowa. And it was only 50 bucks for 2 of them, so I thought I'd give it a go. Infrared converted cameras can be expensive, and besides, I wanted something much more compact that I could take along with me on bike rides than my current infrared setup, which is the Sigma, which is very nice, but very big. And just to have something that if I wiped out on my bike and totally destroyed it, I wouldn't be too upset. Not that that's happened before, but there's always the chance. It's shorter than many other point and shoots. It's just chunkier, which makes it this cool boxy shape. And to get an idea of the size, here it is next to one of its competitors from the time, the Canon PowerShot G5. Sony really experimented with different point and shoot designs that were all pretty tiny, just in different dimensions, from this long pill-shaped to ultra-thin devices. But I was more interested in the V1 for some of its really unique features. Despite being so small, the camera actually has just about everything a serious photographer would want. It has full manual control modes, including little scroll dials for adjusting settings, manual focus, and even a hot shoe for flashes, which looks ridiculous. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good auto digicam too, just for fun, but for anything more serious, it really helps to look for a camera that has these manual controls. It just opens up many more creative options. But the other thing I like to pay attention to for these little cheap cameras is the lens quality. At least on paper, the lens isn't all that impressive. It's a Carl Zeiss branded, like most Sony lenses are at the time, but it's a relatively normal 34 to 136 millimeter equivalent f2.8 to f4. But I've had really good experiences with these branded optics on Sony compact cameras, so I had high hopes for this one. And you may be wondering why the pictures look so weird. That's the most unique feature about the camera. We'll get there in just a second. The Sony V1 is only 5 megapixels, as you probably saw proudly displayed on the front. But for this infrared project, small print sizes will do just fine, and 5 megapixels will work. If you're posting on social media like Instagram, it's also plenty fine. So how does it shoot infrared photos without being an infrared converted camera? This is one of only a handful of cameras, all from Sony, to include a night mode that moves the standard infrared blocking filter away from the sensor so that the camera is sensitive to infrared light. It's sort of like a little night vision goggle feature. The Sony V1 is the cheapest one you can possibly buy with this feature. And it's also the smallest, so that makes it potentially the cheapest way to get into real infrared photography on the go. And this built-in night shot mode even goes so far as to activate these infrared headlights on the front of the lens, which are invisible to the naked eye, but can be clearly seen when you're using this feature. That feature alone is cool for seeing in the dark, but it is limited. You can either only frame your shot with infrared light and then take the picture normally, or you can take the picture with IR light, but only using limited modes on the camera, and you're stuck to this green sepia filter, or black and white picture profiles. But what I'm interested in is shooting it in that infrared mode, but in daylight, and then in any of the manual modes that I want. And fortunately, there's a hack for that, and it involves this $10 magnet. The mechanism that moves that filter out of the way in that special night shot mode is controlled by a magnet. And by using a strong enough magnet placed in the right location at the bottom of the camera, it will remove that filter in any other mode without any limitation. That click you're hearing is the filter moving out of the way. And when that happens, the camera can now capture infrared light in any mode. With an accessory attachment screwed around the lens, I can add external filters to block different amounts of visible light for some really cool effects. And all this on paper sounded really good to me, which is why I picked up the camera. And I've been able to get some really neat infrared shots like what you're seeing. I would almost be able to recommend this camera to anyone looking for a compact, cheap infrared setup. It's almost the perfect cheap infrared camera, except there are some big cons. You may have noticed that all the pictures seem kind of bad quality, but it's actually not the lens or the sensor issue. The images are very crisp without this hack, and even with the hack, sometimes crisp. It's a focusing issue when you do this magnet hack. The camera cannot accurately detect focus, even in manual focus mode. And if you've done IR photography before, you might know that infrared is going to focus at a different point than visual light, but that's not the problem here. The problem is that the filter moves away from the camera. The lens needs to compensate for that to adjust focus. It apparently does this in the official night shot mode, but not when we're using the magnet hack. And I've tested this extensively. For close-up objects, it works totally fine. For infinity focus, you need to zoom in a tad, and even then it's just inconsistent when it gets in focus and when it doesn't. Manual focus is also inaccurate and it won't work here. But just to argue for a second, there is kind of a neat aesthetic to these images, even if they're really, really flawed. After a minute, you get used to them, the out of focusness. I mean, the infrared definitely helps the appeal, and then they just look like colorful, abstract shots. I think actually a more talented photographer could make a whole project with this blurry IR Chrome shots. By the way, almost all these photos are straight out of the camera JPEGs with no editing, which speaks to the potential power of this cheap, tiny, and easy infrared setup. But it's also because this camera doesn't shoot RAW, which I completely missed until after I bought it, and it's a huge downside. Let me show you my settings. I'm using a Kolari IR Chrome filter, but there's other cheaper filter solutions that will get you close to this ballpark in color, like a 580 nanometer filter or something. I just happen to own one already and I really like it, so that's what I'm using. And then I set the white balance to this flash mode, which produced the orangiest foliage for me. You can also set up a custom white balance to do this. Then I have the contrast and the saturation bumped to their highest notches, and that's it. A pretty simple setup with some really cool results. Other cons include the proprietary Sony memory card format. If you ever go after one of these cameras, make sure the card is included or to add that to the cost because they're kind of hard to find. And then there's these lousy small batteries. They still make third-party batteries today, they just don't hold very much charge, and I was constantly having to charge them. There's this later compact model called the V3 that apparently can do the same thing. Might have the same problems, we'll see. I'm gonna try this one next. And then if you just wanna see a bigger camera that can do it even better than this, the Sony f2.8 is amazing. I'll leave that video here. Until next time, as always, happy snapping.